At 31 years old, Hannah Brooks lost everything she had spent years building. Her little bookstore, the dream she had poured her heart, her savings, and countless sleepless nights into, closed its doors for the very last time. Bankrupt, overwhelmed by debt, and convinced she had failed at life. She packed what little remained into the trunk of her aging car, with no idea where she would go next. People pitied her. Some quietly suggested she should give up chasing impossible dreams and start over somewhere else. Then, just when it seemed there was nothing left to inherit except bills and disappointment, a lawyer handed Hannah the deed to an abandoned Victorian reading hall, left to her by an elderly woman she barely remembered meeting as a child. Everyone laughed when they heard about it. A crumbling old building with no visitors, no income, and years of neglect sounded like one more burden she couldn't possibly afford. But while restoring a forgotten genealogy cabinet inside the silent reading hall, Hannah uncovered a hidden passage leading to a secret archive filled with thousands of family histories that no one knew still existed. And buried among generations of forgotten names was her own family tree, one that would reveal why she had inherited the building in the first place, and how a secret kept for decades would completely change everything she believed about where she came from. But before we unlock that hidden archive together, I'd love to know where you're listening from today and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below. I genuinely enjoy seeing people from every corner of the world gather here to share these remarkable journeys. If you're listening this morning, I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day ahead. If you're settling in tonight, I hope this story reminds you that sometimes losing everything is only the beginning of discovering where you truly belong. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, hidden family legacies, and ordinary people whose quiet kindness changes generations, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. Now, let's go back to the day Hannah Brooks locked the front door of her little bookstore for the very last time, believing she had no future left to inherit. Hannah Brooks stood behind the counter of her little bookstore and listened to the silence where customers used to be. For 7 years, she had opened the shop every morning before sunrise, switched on the warm lamps above the reading tables, brewed coffee in the tiny back room, and arranged handwritten recommendation cards beside the shelves. She had believed effort could protect a dream, but dreams still had rent, electricity, supplier invoices, and loans attached to them. By the time the bank sent its final notice, Hannah had already used every dollar in her savings and sold nearly everything valuable she owned. At 31, she was bankrupt. The last day of business arrived on a cold Thursday in early November. A few loyal customers came to say goodbye. Some bought books they did not need. Others hugged her and promised the town would miss the shop. Hannah thanked each person and smiled until the door closed behind them. Only then did she sit on the floor between half-empty shelves and allow herself to cry. The bookstore had never made her wealthy, but it had given shape to her life. Without it, she felt as if someone had erased the map she had been following. The following week, she sold the remaining shelves, reading chairs, coffee machine, and display tables to pay a small portion of what she owed. Her apartment lease ended soon afterward. She packed her clothes, several favorite novels, a box of photographs, and the old brass bookmark that had belonged to her mother into the trunk of her aging car. Everything else went to auction or donation. Friends offered spare rooms, but Hannah knew most of them had children, crowded homes, and worries of their own. She promised she would manage. In truth, she had no plan beyond surviving another week. On Monday morning, while sorting bankruptcy documents inside a roadside cafe, Her phone rang from an unfamiliar number. "Miss Hannah Brooks?" a calm male voice asked. "Yes." "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Margaret Ellis." Hannah frowned. The name sounded distant, like something heard long ago and nearly forgotten. "I'm sorry, I don't think I know her." "You may have met her when you were very young. She was the final curator of the Ashford Reading Hall." Hannah remembered a tall Victorian building from childhood visits with her mother. Dark wood, high windows, long tables where old men studied newspapers and families searched through records. She also remembered an elderly woman with silver hair who once helped her find a book about family names. The memory vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. Daniel explained that Margaret had died several months earlier. Her will named Hannah as the sole beneficiary of the abandoned reading hall and the small parcel of land surrounding it. Hannah stared at the cold coffee between her hands. There must be a mistake. The documents are very specific. Why would she leave it to me? The will does not explain. He paused. You should understand the property has been closed for nearly 20 years. It needs substantial repairs and generates no income. Hannah almost laughed. She had inherited exactly what she could least afford. Another failing building. 2 days later, she met Daniel at his office and signed the estate papers. He handed her a thick envelope containing the deed, old property records, and a long iron key tied to a wooden tag engraved with the words, Ashford Reading Hall. "Several developers have already expressed interest," he said. "Selling may be the simplest option." Hannah nodded without committing herself. She drove to Ashford that afternoon. The town sat beside a river nearly 2 hours from where her bookstore had been. The reading hall stood at the end of a quiet street lined with mature elm trees and old brick houses. It was larger than she remembered. 3 stories of faded stone rose beneath a steep slate roof. Tall arched windows were clouded with grime. Ivy covered one side of the building, and fallen leaves buried most of the front steps. Above the entrance, carved letters still read, Ashford Reading Hall, though weather had softened their edges. 2 older men walking past noticed Hannah studying the property. "You the woman who inherited it?" one asked. Hannah nodded. The second man shook his hand. "Worthless burden, that place. Roof leaks, pipes are ancient, and nobody's used it in years." "Developers want the land," the first added. "Take the money before the building takes yours." Their warning was practical rather than cruel, but it echoed every fear already inside her. Hannah thanked them and remained on the sidewalk after they left. She could sell. With enough money, she might pay some debt, rent a small apartment, and search for work. It would be sensible. But sensible choices had not saved her bookstore, and for the first time in weeks, she was standing before something that belonged entirely to her. By evening, she had made a decision. She returned to her car, gathered 2 suitcases, a sleeping bag, and a box of canned food. She had nowhere else to go, so the reading hall would have to become home before it became anything more. Several nearby residents watched from their windows as she carried her belongings up the leaf-covered steps. One woman called out, "You're really staying there?" Hannah forced a small smile. "For now." The woman looked doubtful. "You're braver than I am." Or more desperate, Hannah thought. She stood before the massive front doors as the last daylight faded behind the trees. The iron key felt cold and heavy in her hand. She inserted it into the old lock and turned with both hands. At first, nothing moved. Then something deep inside the mechanism released with a slow metallic click. Hannah pushed the doors inward, and the forgotten reading hall opened before her for the first time in nearly 20 years. Hannah slowly pushed the heavy oak doors open, and a deep groan echoed through the empty reading hall as hinges that had not moved in decades reluctantly gave way. Cool air carrying the scent of aged paper, polished wood, and forgotten years drifted toward her. She stood motionless for a long moment, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim light filtering through tall, stained glass windows coated in dust. The silence felt different from the silence inside her closed bookstore. That silence had spoken of endings. This one seemed to be waiting. She stepped inside carefully. Every footstep echoed across wide hardwood floors, hidden beneath years of dust. The entrance hall opened into an enormous reading room, with soaring ceilings supported by carved oak beams. Long reading tables stretched across the center of the room, exactly as they had decades earlier, though every surface wore a thick gray blanket of neglect. Hundreds of tall bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Many still held books arranged neatly despite the years. Others leaned slightly where the floor had settled, but remarkably few had collapsed. Sunlight slipped through stained glass windows, scattering soft colors across abandoned chairs and forgotten shelves. Hannah slowly walked between the tables, brushing her fingertips across worn wood, polished smooth by generations of readers. Small brass reading lamps still stood where they had last been switched off. Ink bottles rested beside handwritten catalog cards. One open notebook remained on a reference desk, as though someone intended to return after lunch and never did. Beyond the main hall, she discovered several smaller rooms. One had served as a genealogy research room, its walls lined with large wooden cabinets labeled by family names. Another contained local newspapers preserved inside tall wooden drawers. Upstairs, she found quiet reading balconies overlooking the great hall below, along with several offices, including one that had clearly belonged to the building's final curator. The office desk remained intact, though most drawers contained only maintenance records, supply receipts, and faded correspondence concerning declining budgets during the reading hall's final years. Someone had removed anything obviously valuable long ago, yet the building still possessed an undeniable dignity. Hannah spent the remainder of the afternoon opening windows wherever they still functioned, allowing fresh autumn air to move gently through the hall. She swept enough space beside the large stone fireplace to unroll her sleeping bag. The electricity had long since been disconnected, but she had camping lanterns, blankets, bottled water, and canned food. It wasn't comfortable. Yet for the first time since losing her bookstore, she slept beneath a roof she didn't have to leave in the morning. She woke just after sunrise to soft golden light pouring through the stained glass windows. Birds perched outside the high arches, filling the silent building with gentle song. Hannah brewed instant coffee over a small camping stove and quietly watched the colors spread across the reading room floor. The old building no longer felt abandoned. It simply felt lonely. Around mid-morning, she heard footsteps approaching the entrance. An elderly man entered carrying 2 grocery bags and a long cardboard tube tucked beneath one arm. He wore an old tweed jacket despite the mild weather and smiled kindly when he saw Hannah. "You must be Hannah Brooks." She nodded cautiously. "Samuel Whitaker," he said, offering his hand. "I volunteered here for nearly 40 years before we finally closed the doors." Hannah immediately recognized warmth in his eyes rather than curiosity. Samuel lifted the grocery bags. "Thought someone living inside an empty reading hall might appreciate breakfast." Hannah laughed softly, for what felt like the first time in weeks. Inside the bags, she found fresh bread, soup, fruit, coffee, bottled water, cleaning supplies, and several new batteries for her lantern. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Samuel looked around the great reading room with quiet affection. Margaret would have been happy someone opened the doors again. They sat together at one of the long reading tables while sharing sandwiches Samuel had prepared. As they ate, he described the reading hall during its busiest years. Families gathered every weekend to research their ancestry. School children learned local history beneath the stained glass windows. Elderly couples spent afternoons adding names to community family trees. Volunteers helped newcomers trace immigration records and military service documents. Margaret always said people came looking for names, Samuel recalled, but they usually left understanding themselves a little better. Hannah asked about Margaret Ellis. Samuel smiled. She believed every family deserved to know where it came from, whether they owned a mansion or rented one small room. Wealth never impressed her. Stories did. Before leaving, Samuel handed Hannah the cardboard tube. Inside were original floor plans of the reading hall he had rescued before the building closed. "Thought these might help if you're making repairs." Hannah thanked him again as he quietly disappeared down the front steps. Over the next several days, she settled into a routine. Mornings were spent cleaning one room at a time. Afternoons, she searched for temporary bookkeeping work online, using the library computer at the town hall. Evenings, she returned to continue restoring the reading hall. Every cleaned window invited more sunlight inside. Every swept floor revealed beautiful hardwood beneath the dust. Every polished reading table reminded her that thousands of people had once gathered here searching for pieces of their own history. Late one afternoon, a black luxury sedan stopped outside the building. A sharply dressed man stepped onto the porch, carrying a leather portfolio. "Ms. Brooks?" he asked politely. "Yes?" "Victor Langley." He extended his hand. "I own several commercial properties nearby." Hannah had already heard the name from neighbors. Victor glanced around the building before continuing. "I understand you've inherited the reading hall." "That's right." He smiled pleasantly. "Congratulations. Though I imagine you've realized what an expensive responsibility it is." Hannah remained silent. Victor opened his portfolio. "I'd like to purchase the property." He explained that restoring such an old building would cost far more than it could ever earn. He already owned neighboring land and planned a tasteful redevelopment project that would benefit the town. Selling now, he suggested, would free Hannah from overwhelming financial burdens while providing enough money to rebuild her own life. Hannah looked across the magnificent reading room behind him. Only a week earlier, she probably would have accepted immediately. But something had quietly changed since unlocking the old doors. She no longer saw only an abandoned building. She saw possibility. "Thank you," she replied politely, "but I'm not ready to sell." Victor studied her for a moment before handing her a business card. "If you ever reconsider, my offer will remain open." After he left, Hannah slipped the card into her pocket without reading it. That evening, she began repairing one of the enormous genealogy cabinets standing against the eastern wall of the research room. Several drawers refused to open because the cabinet had shifted over time. While attempting to straighten its heavy oak frame, she noticed something unusual. The cabinet stood several inches away from the stone wall behind it. Curious. She tapped gently along the back panel. Most of the wall produced a solid sound, but near the center, the echo suddenly became hollow. Hannah frowned. She carefully removed several empty drawers to lighten the cabinet, then pushed with all her strength. Slowly, the massive cabinet slid forward just enough to reveal a narrow wooden doorway concealed behind it. Dust covered the old brass handle, and beyond a small crack in the opening, She could see rows of hidden shelves disappearing into darkness. Hannah stood motionless before the narrow wooden door concealed behind the massive genealogy cabinet. Dust covered the brass handle so completely that it blended into the aged oak surrounding it. She brushed the metal gently with the sleeve of her sweater, revealing delicate carvings of intertwined family trees, open books, and small oak leaves winding around the edge. Whoever had built the doorway had done so with extraordinary care. It was never meant to be noticed by someone passing through the room. Hannah wrapped her fingers around the cool brass handle and slowly pressed it downward. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the old latch released with a soft, metallic click. The heavy wooden door opened inward only a few inches before years of settled dust resisted its movement. She pushed carefully again until there was enough space to step through. Her flashlight illuminated a narrow archive room unlike anything she had expected. Floor-to-ceiling wooden shelves lined both walls, each protected behind glass front cabinets. The air felt remarkably dry, carrying the scent of cedar rather than mildew. It was immediately obvious that this room had been built not simply to store records, but to preserve them for generations. Hannah walked slowly down the narrow aisle. There were no ordinary library books. Instead, every shelf contained thick genealogy volumes, handwritten family trees, parish registers, birth records, marriage certificates, immigration documents, military service records, faded family photographs, and carefully wrapped bundles of correspondence. Every collection had been organized by surname instead of subject. Small handwritten labels identified family names that stretched back more than a century. Hannah carefully removed one leather-bound volume from an unlocked shelf. Across the cover, someone had written, "The Carter Family, 1842 to 1976. Inside, she found generations of births, marriages, handwritten memories, photographs, maps of family farms, letters exchanged during wars, newspaper clippings, and carefully drawn family trees extending across several pages. None of it looked official or government-issued. It had clearly been assembled by a family determined not to lose its own history. Hannah gently returned the volume to its place. Another shelf contained the genealogy of railroad workers whose families had settled in Ashford after the first railway arrived. Nearby rested collections documenting immigrant families from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Germany, and Mexico. There were binders preserving adoption records donated voluntarily by descendants, oral histories recorded by grandparents, handwritten memoirs explaining family traditions, recipe books passed through generations, and albums identifying relatives standing together in photographs dating back nearly 100 years. Hannah slowly sat on a small wooden chair placed beside an old catalog cabinet. She had always believed libraries preserved published knowledge. This hidden room preserved something even more personal. It protected belonging. The following morning, she drove to Samuel Whitaker's small house, carrying several notes about what she had discovered. Samuel listened quietly while she described the hidden archive. His weathered face softened with recognition. "So Margaret finally trusted someone enough to find it," he whispered. Hannah looked surprised. "You knew it existed?" Samuel smiled gently. "I suspected there was something beyond those genealogy cabinets. Margaret disappeared behind them often enough." He admitted she never invited anyone inside, not even volunteers who had worked beside her for decades. Whenever people asked what occupied so much of her time, she simply replied, "Some families need quiet places until they're ready to be remembered." Hannah repeated the sentence softly. Samuel nodded. "Those words stayed with me all these years." That afternoon, Samuel introduced Hannah to Professor Olivia Carter, who taught local history and genealogy at the nearby community college. Olivia immediately became fascinated after hearing about the hidden room. Together, they carefully entered the archive carrying notebooks, cotton gloves, and pencils. Olivia walked slowly through the shelves, reading surnames aloud. Every few minutes, she recognized another local family. "Some of these names still fill half the town," she said quietly. "Others disappeared generations ago." Rather than opening every collection, they began creating a careful inventory, listing only visible labels, dates, and cabinet locations. By evening, a remarkable pattern had emerged. The archive preserved the genealogies of hundreds of ordinary families spanning nearly 150 years. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, midwives, railroad workers, miners, nurses, ministers, blacksmiths, factory workers, immigrant families, school children, veterans, widows. Every collection belonged to people whose names rarely appeared in history books. Yet together they formed the living history of an entire community. Olivia closed her notebook slowly. "I've worked with county archives for years," she said. "I've never seen anything this complete." Hannah smiled. "Margaret didn't preserve famous families." Olivia nodded. "She preserved everyone's." During the following week, the two women returned every afternoon after Hannah finished cleaning the reading hall. They cataloged shelves without disturbing their organization, photographed labels, and carefully noted relationships between different family collections. Samuel often joined them, recognizing surnames and sharing memories of people who once visited Margaret searching for lost relatives. Again and again, they discovered that Margaret had continued updating family records long after many descendants had moved away. Marriage notices, military records, births, deaths, immigration updates, cemetery maps, and handwritten correspondence connected generations separated by time and distance. One afternoon, Olivia carefully opened a shallow cabinet, expecting additional genealogy charts. Instead, she discovered dozens of archival boxes tied neatly with linen ribbon. Inside rested original family Bibles, christening records, handwritten memoirs explaining difficult family decisions, and sealed envelopes donated with written permission to be opened only by future descendants. "These aren't just records," Olivia whispered. "They're family voices." Hannah nodded quietly. She suddenly understood why Margaret had never placed these collections on public display. They required trust, patience, and compassion rather than curiosity. As Olivia continued documenting another shelf, she suddenly stopped before a tall walnut cabinet standing alone against the far wall. Unlike every surrounding case, this cabinet remained securely locked. A small brass plaque had been fastened beneath the keyhole. Hannah brushed away years of dust until the engraved words became visible. The inscription was simple but unmistakable. "Open only when the family is ready." Neither woman spoke. Hannah looked from the brass plaque to the silent rows of preserved genealogies surrounding it, realizing that somewhere behind the locked cabinet waited a family story Margaret Ellis had believed the world should not discover until exactly the right moment. Hannah stood before the locked walnut cabinet marked, "Open only when the family is ready," resting her fingertips lightly against the polished brass plaque. During the past several days, she had come to recognize Margaret Ellis through the care woven into every corner of the hidden archive. Nothing had been placed carelessly. Every genealogy, photograph, letter, and handwritten family history had been preserved with deliberate purpose. If Margaret had chosen to lock one cabinet while leaving hundreds of others accessible, Hannah believed there had to be a compassionate reason, rather than a mysterious one. She slowly stepped back. "Not yet," she said quietly. Olivia smiled with approval. "I think Margaret would be glad you said that." Instead of forcing the cabinet open, they continued studying the collections that families had clearly intended future generations to discover. Every genealogy revealed another ordinary life that history had quietly overlooked. One family history described 3 sisters who operated the town's first bakery after losing their parents at a young age. Another preserved the handwritten memories of a blacksmith whose work repaired nearly every wagon that once traveled through Ashford. A school teacher had carefully recorded the names of every student she taught over 42 years, adding short notes beside each one whenever she later learned about their lives. Hannah found herself smiling again and again as she read about weddings celebrated in church basements, children born during harsh winters, neighbors sharing harvests after storms, and families rebuilding their lives after fires destroyed everything they owned. None of the stories described famous people, yet together they explained how an entire town had quietly survived generation after generation. Samuel visited that afternoon, carrying several old photograph albums rescued when the reading hall first closed. Together they spread them across one of the long genealogy tables beneath the stained glass windows. Every page revealed families gathered for reunions, children proudly standing beside grandparents, volunteers helping visitors trace ancestry, and long rows of neighbors attending genealogy workshops Margaret organized each spring. Hannah noticed that Margaret herself appeared in very few photographs. When she did, she almost always stood quietly near the edge of the picture while smiling at everyone else. "She never wanted attention," Samuel said gently. "She believed the families belonged in the center." Olivia nodded. "That's why this place feels different from a museum." Hannah looked around the great reading room. "It's preserving relationships, not simply records." Samuel smiled. "Exactly." During the following week, Hannah and Olivia continued cataloging the visible archive while Samuel identified dozens of families from memory. They discovered that many genealogy collections had been donated by elderly residents, worried younger generations might someday lose track of where they came from. Others arrived after families recovered letters, photographs, and Bibles from old attics, hoping someone would protect them long after they were gone. Margaret accepted every collection under the same promise. Family history would never become entertainment. It would remain a gift passed respectfully from one generation to the next. The work slowly transformed Hannah's own heart. Only a month earlier, she believed bankruptcy had erased everything she had built. Now she spent every afternoon helping preserve identities stretching back more than a century. She realized that financial success and personal worth had never been the same thing. One rainy Saturday, news about volunteers restoring the Reading Hall spread through Ashford. Curious neighbors began stopping by carrying faded photographs, handwritten family trees, military records, and marriage certificates they had recently discovered in drawers or attics. A retired nurse donated 3 journals written by her grandmother describing life during the influenza epidemic. An elderly farmer brought carefully folded land maps showing how neighboring families shared crops during years of drought. Several young volunteers offered to clean windows, repair furniture, and organize donated materials. The reading hall slowly filled with quiet conversations between people who had never met but suddenly discovered shared ancestors or common family stories. Hannah often stood near the entrance, simply listening. She realized Margaret had preserved far more than genealogies. She had preserved community itself. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Hannah carefully returned the day's donations to secure cabinets before locking the hidden archive. She checked every window, extinguished her lanterns one by one, and settled into her sleeping bag beside the old fireplace. Sometime after midnight, she awoke to an unfamiliar sound echoing somewhere below. At first, she assumed another loose board had shifted with the changing temperature. Then came a second, unmistakable noise. A metal filing drawer sliding open. Hannah reached immediately for her flashlight and quietly crossed the dark reading hall. Moonlight spilled through the stained glass windows as she moved silently toward Margaret's former office. The office door stood partly open. Hannah was certain she had closed it before going to bed. She shined her flashlight inside and stopped. Filing cabinets had been pulled open. Old correspondence, property files, genealogy indexes, maintenance records, and catalog cards lay scattered across the floor. Someone had searched quickly but carefully. She immediately turned toward the genealogy room. The massive cabinet concealing the hidden doorway remained exactly where she had left it. No drawers had been removed, no secret passage exposed. Whoever entered the reading hall had never discovered the hidden archive. Relief washed over her. Minutes later, Sheriff Nathan Reed arrived after Hannah called the local emergency number. He examined the disturbed office carefully without touching anything. "Interesting," he said after several minutes. "Nothing expensive appears to be missing." Hannah nodded. Only old records were disturbed. Nathan looked thoughtfully across the scattered papers. "Which means whoever came here wasn't searching for valuables." He paused before adding quietly, "They were searching for information." After the sheriff left, Hannah slowly began gathering the papers back into neat stacks. Several old property maps appeared to be missing, along with a handful of historical correspondence. Everything else remained untouched. Standing alone in the quiet office, Hannah looked toward the hidden genealogy room beyond the eastern wall. Whoever had entered the reading hall had searched every obvious place for historical records. They had walked within only a few feet of the greatest collection of forgotten family histories in the region, and never realized it had been waiting silently behind the wall all along. The morning after Sheriff Nathan Reed completed his inspection, Hannah and Olivia carefully returned every scattered document to its proper place. Although only a few old property maps and historical correspondence appeared to be missing, the break-in left both women uneasy. Someone had entered the reading hall with a clear purpose. They had ignored furniture, old equipment, and anything that might have been sold. They wanted records. Hannah still chose not to tell anyone beyond Samuel, Olivia, and Sheriff Reed about the hidden genealogy archive. Samuel agreed immediately. "Margaret protected those collections for decades," he said quietly. "Until we understand why someone searched this building, we protect them too." Hannah nodded. "The families trusted her. Now they're trusting us." Rather than dwelling on the intrusion, they returned to the work Margaret had begun so many years earlier. Olivia continued comparing surnames preserved inside the archive with county census records, church registries, cemetery records, and newspaper archives. Many genealogy collections included written permission allowing direct descendants to view them after the original donor's passing. Late one afternoon, Olivia looked up from her notebook with excitement in her eyes. "I found someone," she said, "the granddaughter of Eleanor Pierce." Hannah immediately recognized the name from one of the beautifully organized genealogy volumes. 2 days later, an elderly woman named Rose Bennett entered the reading hall, carrying a faded wedding photograph tucked carefully inside an envelope. Hannah welcomed her into the main reading room before gently placing Eleanor Pierce's genealogy book on the long oak table. Rose rested one trembling hand upon the worn leather cover before speaking. grandmother spent years writing this," she whispered. After she died, everyone believed the manuscript had been lost forever. With Rose's permission, Hannah opened the first pages and quietly read several passages describing Eleanor's parents arriving in Ashford with little more than a horse, a wagon, and hope for a better future. The handwritten memories spoke of difficult harvests, neighbors sharing food during hard winters, and family traditions passed lovingly from one generation to the next. Tears slowly filled Rose's eyes. "That's her voice," she said softly. "I can almost hear her speaking again." Before leaving, she donated several additional family photographs Margaret had never received, asking only that future generations be allowed to discover them alongside the genealogy. During the following week, Olivia located descendants from several more collections. One family discovered the original diary of a great-grandfather who had worked on the railroad before opening the town's first repair shop. Another found carefully documented immigration records, proving stories their grandparents had repeated for decades were true. A young couple researching their family tree unexpectedly learned that two branches of their family had quietly supported one another during the Great Depression after losing neighboring farms. None of the discoveries involved hidden fortunes or dramatic scandals. Instead, they restored something far more meaningful. They returned forgotten connections to families who had slowly lost them through time. Every reunion transformed the atmosphere inside the reading hall. Descendants gathered around long reading tables where their grandparents had once searched through records decades earlier. Children listened as elderly relatives explained names written carefully beneath faded photographs. Grandparents smiled while pointing toward hand-drawn family trees that suddenly made sense for the first time. Hannah noticed something remarkable. People rarely hurried through the collections. They read slowly, carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid the voices of their ancestors might disappear again if they turned the pages too quickly. Word about the restored reading hall spread rapidly throughout Ashford and neighboring towns. Families began arriving with boxes rescued from attics, trunks discovered in barns, and albums forgotten in closets. Some donated military letters. Others contributed baptism records, recipe books, oral histories, school certificates, and handwritten memoirs. Olivia established careful archival procedures, while Hannah gently welcomed every visitor through the front doors. Volunteers soon filled the building each weekend. Retired teachers organized catalog cards. College students digitized indexes. Local carpenters repaired reading tables and bookshelves. A retired photographer carefully restored damaged family portraits using modern preservation techniques. Even neighbors who claimed no interest in genealogy arrived carrying coffee, homemade soup, or fresh flowers for the entrance hall. The forgotten reading hall slowly became the heart of the community once again. Hannah often stood quietly near the stained glass windows watching strangers discover they shared ancestors, childhood stories, or forgotten family friendships. She realized Margaret had never simply preserved genealogy. She had preserved belonging. One crisp autumn afternoon, Victor Langley stopped outside while volunteers painted the front porch railings. He looked through the open entrance toward families gathered around genealogy tables. "You've been busy," he observed politely. Hannah smiled. People missed this place more than they realized. Victor nodded slowly. Community attention changes development plans. Sometimes history deserves to stay where it happened. Victor glanced toward the restored reading room before meeting her eyes again. "My offer to purchase the property still stands if you ever decide restoration becomes too difficult." Hannah thanked him sincerely, but declined once more. After Victor drove away, Samuel joined her on the front steps carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Together they watched children laughing while helping volunteers rake leaves beneath the old maple trees. "Margaret used to sit right here every October," Samuel said quietly. "She believed autumn reminded people to gather family stories before another year disappeared." Hannah smiled. "I wish I'd known her better." Samuel looked toward the stained glass windows glowing warmly behind them. Near the end of her life, I asked why she kept protecting genealogies most families had forgotten. He paused, remembering carefully. She smiled and said, "Every family deserves to know where it began." Hannah waited. Samuel's expression softened even further. Then she added something I've never forgotten. He looked directly at Hannah before quietly repeating Margaret's exact words. "One family is still waiting." Hannah turned slowly toward the hidden genealogy room beyond the eastern wall. Somewhere behind the locked cabinet marked "Open only when the family is ready," she knew the unfinished family Margaret had spoken about was still waiting patiently for the moment its story could finally come home. The morning after Samuel repeated Margaret Ellis's mysterious words, Olivia arrived carrying a weathered archival box borrowed from the County Historical Society. She carefully placed it on the long genealogy table beneath the stained glass window before smiling at Hannah. "I think I found something Margaret intended us to read before we even think about opening that locked cabinet." Inside the box rested 6 leather-bound journals, each marked with a single year and Margaret's unmistakably elegant handwriting. Unlike the family genealogies preserved throughout the hidden archive, these journals belonged to Margaret herself. Hannah opened the earliest volume with quiet care. The first pages contained ordinary notes about maintenance budgets, volunteer schedules, genealogy workshops, and donations received by the Reading Hall. But as the years passed, Margaret's writing gradually became more reflective. She rarely described herself. Instead, she wrote about the families who entered the building. "People arrive believing they are searching for names," one entry read. "Most are actually searching for belonging." Hannah smiled softly. Another page simply said, "A family tree is not a record of blood alone. It is a record of kindness carried from one generation to the next." Samuel looked across the table. That sounds exactly like her. As they continued reading, another pattern slowly emerged. Margaret carefully documented conversations with elderly residents who quietly entrusted their family histories to the reading hall. Some feared their grandchildren would someday throw old papers away without understanding their value. Others worried difficult chapters of family history might be forgotten forever. Margaret accepted every collection with the same promise. "Your family will never disappear while these walls are standing." Olivia slowly closed one journal. She wasn't collecting genealogy. Hannah nodded. She was protecting identity. The later journals revealed just how seriously Margaret honored that promise. Whenever someone donated a genealogy collection, she carefully interviewed them, confirmed relationships, labeled photographs with every recognizable face, traced changing family surnames through marriage, and updated addresses whenever descendants moved away. She often spent years corresponding with relatives who had settled in distant states simply to keep one family tree complete. None of it was required. She simply believed that future generations deserved the chance to know where they came from. One passage stayed with Hannah long after she finished reading it. "Famous families already have historians. Ordinary families depend upon someone willing to remember." Hannah closed the journal gently. She suddenly understood why the hidden archive felt so personal. Margaret had never treated genealogy as research. She treated it as an act of compassion. During the following weeks, Hannah and Olivia began preserving the oldest family records using professional archival methods Samuel helped them learn decades earlier. Acid-free folders replaced brittle envelopes. Damaged family Bibles received careful repairs. Photographs were cleaned, labeled, and stored inside protective sleeves. Handwritten letters were flattened, cataloged, and carefully indexed. Every document returned to its shelf in better condition than when it had arrived. Hannah discovered unexpected joy in the work. It required patience instead of speed, attention rather than ambition. Each restored page felt like another forgotten ancestor receiving one more chance to speak. Volunteers continued arriving nearly every weekend. Retired school teachers organized genealogy indexes. College students entered catalog information into newly created databases. Local carpenters repaired damaged cabinetry without accepting payment. Neighbors donated comfortable reading chairs, archival supplies, and restored display cases. The reading hall gradually looked less like an abandoned building and more like a living home for family history. One afternoon, Hannah stepped outside carrying broken shelving destined for the recycling pile and noticed surveyors placing bright orange markers across the vacant property beside the reading hall. Heavy equipment arrived shortly afterward. Samuel joined her quietly on the front steps. "Victor Langley purchased the neighboring lot yesterday," he said. Hannah watched construction crews taking measurements. "Do you think he'll keep trying to buy this place?" Samuel smiled gently. "Probably. But I don't think he's the only one planning for the future." That evening, Hannah returned alone to Margaret's journals. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows while the old building settled around her. Near the back of the final notebook, she discovered an entry unlike any she had read before. "The public genealogy belongs upon the shelves," Margaret had written. "The entrusted genealogy belongs beneath them." Hannah frowned thoughtfully. She turned the page and found a folded pencil sketch tucked carefully inside the journal. It showed the original floor plan of the reading hall. Margaret had drawn every reading room, office, staircase, and the concealed genealogy archive hidden behind the eastern cabinet. But another room appeared beneath the original genealogy hall, far larger than any basement shown on official architectural plans. A small handwritten arrow pointed downward beside only 5 words, "Where every family begins again." Early the next morning, Hannah carried the journal to Olivia. Together, they compared Margaret's drawing with the original building blueprints Samuel had brought weeks earlier. Every hallway, staircase, and room matched perfectly except for one section beneath the genealogy room. According to the original plans, a large underground chamber should have existed beneath the eastern side of the building, yet no staircase leading there appeared anywhere in the public layout. "That space was intentionally hidden," Olivia whispered. Samuel adjusted his glasses while studying both drawings. Margaret hid one archive behind a cabinet. He looked thoughtfully toward the genealogy room. Who's to say she didn't hide another beneath it? The three returned immediately to the concealed archive, carrying measuring tapes, flashlights, and copies of the original plans. They carefully compared shelf dimensions with wall lengths until Hannah noticed something unusual behind the largest genealogy catalog cabinet. According to the blueprint, nearly 6 feet of interior space remained unaccounted for. She knelt and brushed years of dust from the wooden floor. Faint scrape marks crossed several floorboards, as though heavy furniture had been moved repeatedly long ago. Samuel helped slide the catalog cabinet aside inch by inch. Hidden beneath it rested a square brass floor plate almost invisible beneath old varnish. At its center lay a small, recessed iron handle. Hannah looked first at Samuel, then at Olivia. Neither spoke. She reached down, wrapped her fingers around the cold metal handle, and pulled gently upward. The wooden floor lifted on concealed hinges with surprising ease. Cool air rose quietly from the darkness below. Hannah aimed her flashlight into the opening. Narrow stone steps descended beneath the reading hall, disappearing into a place Margaret Ellis had spent a lifetime protecting from everyone except the family she had patiently been waiting to welcome home. Hannah stood quietly at the edge of the hidden staircase, her flashlight casting a narrow beam across worn stone steps that disappeared beneath the reading hall. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the faint scent of cedar, aged paper, and polished oak rather than damp earth. Samuel rested one hand against the opened floor panel and smiled softly. Margaret always believed the most important rooms were the ones people had to earn. Hannah looked into the darkness below but didn't move. After everything she had learned from Margaret's journals, forcing her way forward no longer felt right. Olivia seemed to understand the same thing. She wanted us to understand why she protected these families before we discovered what else she protected. Hannah slowly nodded. Together they gently lowered the concealed floor panel back into place. The hidden room beneath would still be waiting tomorrow. Margaret had preserved it for decades. One more night would change nothing. Instead, they returned upstairs carrying the journals, determined to finish understanding the remarkable woman who had quietly dedicated her life to preserving ordinary families. During the following week, the reading hall became busier than Hannah had ever imagined. Families arrived almost daily after hearing stories about the restored genealogy collections. Grandparents brought grandchildren to trace family trees together. Brothers and sisters reunited after discovering branches of their family they never knew existed. Volunteers cataloged donations while children filled the reading tables beneath the stained glass windows. The old building no longer echoed with emptiness. It echoed with conversation. One rainy afternoon, Olivia carefully unfolded a faded newspaper clipping that had slipped between the pages of Margaret's final journal. The photograph showed a much younger Hannah sitting cross-legged on the floor of the children's reading corner, completely absorbed in an oversized picture book. Samuel smiled the instant he saw it. "I remember that Saturday." Hannah looked surprised. "You do?" "You couldn't have been more than 9. Samuel replied warmly. "Your father brought you here almost every weekend before." His voice faded gently. Hannah nodded. Her father had passed away when she was 11. Those early visits had become distant memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Olivia carefully turned the newspaper clipping over. Written on the back in Margaret's familiar blue ink were several simple words. "Always returns books with gratitude. Helps younger readers without being asked. Notices names before titles." Hannah stared silently at the handwriting. She had never imagined anyone had been quietly paying attention to such ordinary moments. Olivia continued searching the journal and soon discovered another clipping taken several years later during a community genealogy workshop. Teenagers filled the reading room while volunteers helped families organize old photographs. Hannah appeared quietly in the background, labeling picture envelopes for elderly visitors. Margaret had written another note beneath the photograph. "Still believes every stranger deserves patience." Samuel chuckled softly. Margaret noticed things most people walked right past. Hannah smiled faintly. "I thought I was invisible." Samuel shook his hand. "Not to a librarian." Later that afternoon, Olivia reached the final pages of one journal and suddenly stopped reading aloud. "Hannah," she whispered. Hannah looked up. Olivia slowly turned the open journal toward her. Margaret had written an entire entry devoted to Hannah's family. She explained that many years earlier, While helping Hannah's father research his ancestry, she discovered an extraordinary connection buried inside forgotten land records, church registries, and handwritten family journals preserved in the Reading Hall. Margaret never shared the discovery because Hannah was still a child, and her father asked her to wait until the proper time. Some truths belong to people only after life has prepared them to understand, Margaret had written. Hannah's heart began beating faster. She continued reading. Margaret described Hannah's father as a quiet man, deeply proud of his family's history, but determined that his daughter should build her own life rather than feel burdened by inherited expectations. He never wanted Hannah growing up believing she had been chosen because of family lineage. Instead, he hoped she would become the kind of person who naturally deserved responsibility through her own compassion. Margaret honored that promise for decades. She quietly followed Hannah's life through occasional visits, community reading programs, and conversations with Samuel whenever he happened to mention seeing her in town. She never interfered. She simply waited. "The reading hall does not need an owner," Margaret wrote. "It needs a guardian who understands that every family deserves equal dignity." Hannah slowly lowered the journal. Tears filled her eyes as years of confusion quietly settled into understanding. Margaret had never selected her because she happened to share a family connection. She had waited until Hannah became the person capable of protecting every family as carefully as her own. Olivia gently squeezed Hannah's hand. "She trusted your character more than your bloodline." Samuel smiled proudly. "That's why she never told you sooner." As evening approached, Olivia resumed cataloging another genealogy collection. This one belonged to the Langley family. She paused almost immediately after recognizing the surname. "Victor Langley's grandfather," she said quietly. Together they examined the beautifully preserved genealogy. Victor's grandfather, Thomas Langley Sr., had arrived in Ashford as a child after his parents lost everything during the economic collapse many decades earlier. Margaret's notes described how the reading hall quietly helped the struggling family reconstruct missing birth records, immigration papers, and property documents that eventually allowed them to reclaim land and rebuild their lives. Without those genealogy records, the Langley family might never have recovered financially. Hannah looked thoughtfully toward the front windows where Victor had stood more than once offering to buy the building. "Does he know?" Samuel slowly shook his hand. "I don't think so." Hannah closed the genealogy carefully. "Then he deserves to." That evening, after locking the reading hall, the three returned to the concealed genealogy archive. Hannah slid the heavy catalog cabinet aside once more until the hidden brass floor plate appeared beneath it. This time she lifted the concealed hatch completely open. Cool air rose quietly from below exactly as before. Samuel handed her a second flashlight, while Olivia smiled encouragingly. "I think Margaret has finished telling us why she chose you," she said softly. Samuel nodded toward the waiting staircase. "Now she's ready to show you what she's spent a lifetime protecting." Hannah tightened her grip on the flashlight, stepped onto the first worn stone stair, and slowly began descending into the hidden darkness beneath the reading hall, knowing that somewhere below waited the final chapter of her own family's story. Hannah descended the narrow stone staircase one careful step at a time. The beam from her flashlight revealed worn limestone walls that seemed older than the reading hall itself. Despite decades of being sealed away, the passage felt surprisingly fresh. Cool air flowed gently through hidden ventilation shafts built into the stonework, carrying the faint scent of cedar, parchment, and polished wood. Samuel followed a few steps behind while Olivia carefully lowered the concealed hatch above them, leaving only the quiet glow of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. At the bottom of the staircase, the narrow passage widened into an enormous underground chamber. Hannah stopped without speaking. It wasn't simply another archive. It was an entire genealogy sanctuary hidden beneath the reading hall. Thick brick walls surrounded the room, keeping the temperature remarkably stable. Long rows of cedar shelving stretched into the distance, each shelf filled with carefully labeled archival boxes, leather-bound family registers, oversized genealogy ledgers, framed family trees, photograph albums, handwritten memoirs, parish records, cemetery maps, immigration papers, military service files, and carefully rolled family charts tied with linen ribbons. Large oak tables occupied the center of the chamber beneath elegant brass reading lamps. Every chair stood neatly pushed beneath its table, as though the last researcher had simply stepped away for a moment. Nothing felt abandoned. Everything felt patiently preserved. Hannah slowly turned in a circle, overwhelmed by the scale of what Margaret had hidden. "This isn't just Ashford," Olivia whispered while reading the nearest catalog labels. "These records cover the entire region." Samuel nodded slowly, unable to hide his amazement. Margaret spent nearly 50 years building this. Hannah approached the nearest shelving unit. Small brass plaques divided the archive into carefully organized sections. One aisle preserved founding families, another documented immigrant communities. Nearby stood collections devoted to railroad workers, teachers, veterans, farmers, craftsmen, clergy, nurses, merchants, and families whose names had almost disappeared from public memory. Margaret had organized every collection by relationships rather than status. Wealthy families stood beside poor ones. Influential citizens shared shelves with laborers whose names had never appeared in newspapers. Every family occupied equal space. Hannah smiled quietly. Margaret had preserved dignity, not importance. Olivia carefully opened one archival box after confirming Margaret's preservation instructions. Inside rested several beautifully hand-drawn family trees, extending across nearly 2 centuries. Every birth, marriage, adoption, migration, and reunion had been documented with astonishing precision. Beside each chart lay handwritten notes explaining family traditions, favorite recipes, occupations, and stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. "She wanted descendants to inherit more than names," Olivia said softly. "She wanted them to inherit identity." They continued exploring the underground archive slowly, resisting the temptation to rush. One section contained hundreds of oral history transcripts, carefully typed from recorded interviews Margaret had conducted with elderly residents. Another preserved children's drawings illustrating family stories told by grandparents. Nearby stood shelves filled with family recipe books, stained from decades of use. Wedding invitations, anniversary speeches, school report cards, military medals accompanied by written memories, and handwritten letters exchanged between generations separated by wars or migration. Nothing had been chosen because it was financially valuable. Every item had been preserved because it mattered deeply to someone's family. Hannah paused before an enormous wall map covered with hundreds of tiny colored pens connected by delicate threads. Olivia examined the handwritten legend beside it. Margaret had traced how families moved across the country over generations, documenting every major migration while preserving the relationships that remained despite changing addresses and surnames. "She wasn't tracking geography," Hannah whispered. "She was tracking belonging." Samuel smiled. "Exactly." Along the eastern wall stood a long series of shallow wooden drawers. Inside, they discovered thousands of carefully restored photographs identified with names, dates, locations, and handwritten notes. Margaret had recognized nearly every face. Children standing quietly beside fences, young couples on wedding days, families gathered around dinner tables, soldiers returning home, school graduations, church picnics, harvest celebrations, birthday parties, ordinary moments that became priceless simply because someone had cared enough to preserve them. Hannah gently picked up one photograph showing several generations gathered outside the wedding hall decades earlier. On the reverse, Margaret had written only one sentence: "Every family begins as strangers who chose to love one another." Hannah carefully returned it to its protective sleeve. Near the center of the underground chamber stood several beautifully crafted catalog cabinets, unlike anything upstairs. Opening one drawer, Olivia found thousands of handwritten index cards cross-referencing every family: photograph, diary, cemetery record, church register, and genealogy collection preserved throughout the archive. Margaret had created a remarkable system, allowing descendants to reconnect entire family histories, even if surnames had changed repeatedly through marriage, adoption, or migration. Samuel slowly shook his head in admiration. She planned this for people she would never live long enough to meet. At the very heart of the chamber stood a magnificent circular oak table, polished to a warm glow despite the passing years. Resting alone upon its surface was a small walnut chest reinforced with polished brass corners. Unlike every surrounding cabinet, it carried no catalog number. Across the lid, written in Margaret Ellis's unmistakably graceful handwriting, appeared 7 simple words. For Hannah Brooks, when you finally arrive. Hannah stopped several feet away. Her heart beat faster. Samuel quietly removed his glasses while Olivia instinctively stepped backward, understanding that whatever rested inside belonged only to Hannah. She approached slowly and lifted the chest onto the center of the table. It felt surprisingly light. There was no lock. Only a simple brass clasp waited beneath her fingertips. Hannah released it carefully. The lid opened without resistance. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope tied with a faded green ribbon. No money, no deeds, no hidden fortune. Only one carefully folded letter that had waited patiently beneath the reading hall for years. Hannah untied the ribbon with steady hands and turned the envelope over. Written across the front in Margaret Ellis's familiar blue ink were 2 words that instantly made every step of her journey feel worthwhile. Dear Hannah. Hannah carried the small walnut chest from the underground archive into the restored main reading hall before opening the letter. Somehow it felt right that Margaret Ellis's final words should be read beneath the tall stained glass windows where generations of families had first begun searching for their roots. Morning sunlight spilled across the long oak genealogy table as Samuel and Olivia quietly sat nearby. Neither spoke. Hannah carefully untied the faded green ribbon and unfolded the cream-colored pages inside. Margaret's familiar handwriting immediately filled the silent room with warmth. Dear Hannah, the letter began, if these words have reached you, then you have already discovered the greatest truth this reading hall was ever meant to protect. Family history is not about proving where we came from. It is about reminding us that none of us ever walks through life completely alone. Hannah paused for a moment before continuing. Many believed I spent my life collecting names, birth records, marriage certificates, and family trees. They were only seeing the shelves. What I was truly collecting was connection. Every family that entrusted their history to this hall feared the same thing, that one day their grandchildren would no longer know who they were or how much they had been loved. My responsibility was never to preserve paper. It was to preserve belonging. Olivia lowered her eyes while Samuel quietly smiled, recognizing Margaret's voice in every sentence. Hannah continued reading. Margaret explained that many families had donated deeply personal genealogy collections only because they trusted the reading hall to protect difficult truths with dignity. Some records revealed adoptions kept private until future generations were ready. Others documented children raised by relatives during hard times, immigration journeys hidden out of fear, family reconciliations after years of separation, or sacrifices parents quietly made so their children could begin better lives. Every family carries chapters written with both joy and sorrow, Margaret wrote. Neither should ever erase the other. Hannah slowly folded one corner of the page between her fingers. She now understood why the locked cabinet had remained closed. It had never protected secrets out of shame. It protected them out of compassion, until the people most affected were ready to receive them with understanding rather than judgment. Margaret's letter then became deeply personal. Years ago, she wrote, your father came to this reading hall searching for your family's history after your grandfather passed away. Together we followed church records, handwritten journals, old land deeds, and forgotten family Bibles until we uncovered a truth your family had quietly lost across generations. Hannah felt her heart begin to race. She continued reading slowly. Margaret explained that Hannah descended directly from Thomas and Abigail Brooks, the husband and wife who founded the Ashford Reading Hall nearly 130 years earlier. They were not wealthy benefactors or influential politicians. Thomas had been the town's school teacher. Abigail had kept careful records of births, marriages, family stories, and neighborhood histories because she believed every family deserved to know where it belonged. Together they opened the Reading Hall, not simply as a place for books, but as a place where ordinary people could preserve the stories future generations might otherwise lose forever. Hannah stared silently at the page. She had spent weeks restoring the very building her own ancestors had created without ever knowing the connection. Margaret anticipated her surprise. Your father asked me never to tell you while he was alive, the letter continued. He wanted you to build your own character without believing responsibility belonged to you because of blood alone. He hoped that if the reading hall ever returned to your hands, it would be because your compassion had already prepared you for it. Tears quietly rolled down Hannah's cheeks. All those childhood Saturdays spent exploring genealogy shelves with her father suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. He had never simply been teaching her how to read family trees. He had been bringing her home. Margaret's final explanation answered the question Hannah had carried since inheriting the building. I did not leave the reading hall to you because you inherited its founder's name, she wrote. I left it to you because after watching you for many years, I knew you treated every family story with the same respect you would one day give your own. Blood may open one door. Character decides whether we deserve to walk through it. Samuel quietly removed his glasses to wipe away tears. Olivia reached across the table and gently squeezed Hannah's hand. Margaret's final request filled the last page. Please never allow this reading hall to become a monument celebrating one family above another. Your ancestors built it for everyone. Every genealogy here deserves equal care, whether a family arrived yesterday or 2 centuries ago, whether they owned land or rented a single room, whether their history is joyful or painful. They all belong together beneath this roof. Hannah carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside its envelope. The silence that followed felt peaceful rather than empty. Finally, Samuel smiled softly. Thomas and Abigail would be proud. During the weeks that followed, news of the extraordinary genealogy archive spread throughout the county. Historians, archivists, church record specialists, and genealogy researchers visited the Reading Hall after Olivia contacted several preservation organizations. They examined Margaret's remarkable catalog system, the underground archive, the oral histories, family registers, photographs, handwritten memoirs, and carefully preserved genealogies. Every expert reached the same conclusion. The collection represented one of the most complete community genealogy archives in the region, preserving not famous bloodlines, but the interconnected lives of ordinary families across generations. Sheriff Nathan Reed attended several preservation meetings as well. Watching grandparents reunite with forgotten family histories gradually changed his own understanding of the building. "I thought people came here looking for ancestors," he admitted one afternoon. "Turns out, they were really looking for home." Families continued arriving almost every day. Some donated newly discovered journals after realizing Margaret had honored every collection with dignity. Others identified unknown faces and photographs that had remained unnamed for decades. Children interviewed elderly relatives before memories could disappear. The Reading Hall no longer preserved only the past. It inspired today's families to record tomorrow's history. News of the archive eventually reached Victor Langley. He visited quietly one afternoon while preservation experts documented several genealogy collections. Hannah showed him the beautifully preserved records describing how his grandfather's family rebuilt their lives after the Reading Hall helped recover the documents, proving their identity and property rights generations earlier. Victor remained silent for a long time after reading the final page. "My grandfather always told me this building saved our family," he said quietly. "I never understood what he meant until today." Hannah smiled gently. "Now you do." Victor looked around the reading hall where families paralyzed traced their roots together. Some places are worth more standing exactly where they are. Only a few days later, the county officially approved permanent historical protection for the Reading Hall and its underground genealogy archive. That evening, after every visitor had gone home, Hannah placed Margaret's letter carefully back inside its walnut chest. Resting beside it on the genealogy table lay Margaret's final curator journal, the only volume she had intentionally left unread until every promise recorded inside the letter had finally been fulfilled. Hannah rested one hand upon its worn leather cover, knowing that before opening the reading hall to a new generation of families, there remained one final conversation with Margaret waiting inside its pages. Hannah waited until the reading hall had grown completely quiet before opening Margaret Ellis's final journal. Evening sunlight filtered through the restored stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the long genealogy table where generations of families had once gathered to search for their roots. The worn leather cover rested beneath her hands with familiar warmth. She took a slow breath and turned to the final pages. Margaret's handwriting had become slightly less steady with age, but every word remained beautifully clear. "If you are reading this," she began, "then the reading hall has finally found another keeper. That has always been my greatest hope." Hannah smiled gently as she continued reading. Margaret reflected on the years when visitors often believed the reading hall existed to preserve records. She had spent her lifetime learning something much more important. "Records preserve facts," she wrote. "Stories preserve families. Names tell us who came before us. Love explains why they mattered." The next pages described the difficult years before the reading hall closed. Funding disappeared. Volunteers grew older. Attendance declined as people turned to quicker ways of searching for information. Many suggested selling the building while it still held commercial value. Margaret admitted there were evenings when she almost agreed. Then another family would arrive carrying a weathered Bible, a faded photograph, a bundle of handwritten letters, or a carefully folded family tree rescued from an attic. Each time she accepted another collection, she remembered why the reading hall had been built in the first place. Closing a reading hall, she wrote, does not merely lock a building. It closes a doorway between generations. Hannah slowly turned another page. Margaret explained that the underground genealogy archive had never been created to hide secrets. It existed to protect trust. Families donated deeply personal histories because they believed someone would preserve them with kindness until future generations were ready to receive them. Some collections contained painful truths. Others held joyful reunions, quiet sacrifices, and ordinary moments too precious to lose. Every family deserves the dignity of being remembered honestly, Margaret wrote. Not perfectly, honestly. Hannah felt tears quietly gathering again. She remembered standing outside the reading hall months earlier, with nothing but a few suitcases and a future that seemed completely uncertain. She had believed bankruptcy defined her life. Margaret's words gently revealed something different. Failure had only brought her to the place she had always been meant to find. The final pages became deeply personal. Hannah, Margaret wrote, if life has been unkind to you, never mistake hardship for abandonment. Families are not measured by the people who leave us. They are measured by the people who quietly prepare a place for us long before we know we belong there. This reading hall has been waiting for you just as patiently as your ancestors once waited for future generations they would never meet. Hannah closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her father bringing her to the reading hall as a little girl. She remembered tracing names across family trees without understanding that her own ancestors had built the very place where she stood. Most of all, she remembered believing she had lost everything after her bookstore failed. Instead, she had been walking toward the inheritance that mattered most. Margaret's final request occupied only a single page. Please never allow genealogy to become only the study of the past. Let it remain an invitation to compassion. Welcome every family equally. Preserve the stories of newcomers beside those whose roots stretch back generations. Teach children that every family begins with ordinary people trying to build a better tomorrow. If you do that, this reading hall will never truly close again. Hannah gently closed the journal and rested her hand upon its cover. For the first time since inheriting the building, she understood that Margaret had never asked her to preserve history. She had asked her to preserve hope. During the following months, restoration of the Ashford Reading Hall was completed. Local craftsmen repaired the remaining oak shelves while carefully preserving every mark left by decades of readers. Volunteers restored the grand staircase, polished the brass lamps, and refinished the long genealogy tables without erasing their age. New heating and climate systems were installed beneath the floors to protect the underground archive for generations to come, while leaving Margaret's original catalog system untouched. Olivia worked alongside historians and professional archivists to establish permanent preservation standards. Samuel patiently trained younger volunteers in the careful handling of fragile family records, smiling each time another student learned to treat every document with the same respect Margaret had practiced throughout her life. Sheriff Nathan Reed helped secure state recognition for both the Reading Hall and its hidden genealogy archive, ensuring the collections would remain permanently protected. Families continued arriving from towns across the region, carrying boxes rescued from attics, old trunks, church basements, and forgotten closets. They donated family Bibles, handwritten memoirs, immigration papers, recipe books, military letters, school report cards, photographs, oral histories, and carefully drawn family trees. Many admitted they had almost thrown everything away before hearing about the restored Reading Hall. Now they understood those ordinary papers might someday become the greatest gift they could leave their grandchildren. Hannah established a new section within the underground archive called the Family Roots Collection. Every family, regardless of wealth, background, religion, nationality, or how recently they had arrived in Ashford, received the same careful preservation Margaret had always believed they deserved. Along the entrance to the underground archive, Samuel carved a simple wooden sign that Hannah proudly mounted above the doorway. It read, "No family is forgotten here." Nearly 1 year after Hannah first unlocked the abandoned reading hall, the town gathered for its official reopening celebration. Children once again filled the great reading room, while volunteers helped them trace simple family trees. Grandparents smiled as they shared stories beneath the stained glass windows. Historians displayed restored photographs alongside handwritten memoirs preserved for future generations. Families wandered quietly through exhibits celebrating not famous ancestors, but ordinary lives that had quietly shaped the community. Samuel stood beside Hannah near the entrance, watching laughter fill rooms that had remained silent for almost 2 decades. "Margaret always believed this day would come," he whispered. Hannah smiled. "I think she knew someone would eventually finish what she started." During the ceremony, Olivia spoke about the importance of preserving every family story with equal dignity. Sheriff Reed admitted he once believed the building contained only old records until he witnessed generations reconnect through forgotten histories. Finally, Hannah stepped forward to address the gathered crowd. Looking across the room, she remembered arriving with nowhere to live and almost no hope left. "When I inherited this reading hall," she began, "people believed I had received an old, abandoned building. They were only partly right. The building had been forgotten. The families inside it never were." The room grew perfectly still. "This place taught me that knowing where we come from gives us strength to decide where we are going. Every family carries moments of joy, loss, courage, sacrifice, forgiveness, and hope. Every one of those stories deserve to be remembered with kindness. Because when we preserve a family's history, we remind future generations that they have always belonged to something larger than themselves." Warm applause filled the reading hall. As evening settled over Ashford, visitors slowly returned home carrying copies of newly discovered family histories, while children checked out books from shelves that had once stood silent before locking the front door. Hannah walked alone through the peaceful reading room, pausing beneath the wooden sign Samuel had carved. She gently ran her fingers across the words, "No family is forgotten here." At 31, Hannah Brooks believed bankruptcy had taken away her future. Instead, it led her home to the place her ancestors built generations earlier, not so she could own it, but so she could continue their promise that every family, every ordinary life, and every forgotten story would always have a place where it belonged. And as the lights quietly faded inside the reading hall, another generation of family stories had already begun waiting for someone, many years from now, to discover that they had never truly been forgotten. Some people spend their entire lives searching for where they belong. Hannah Brooks believed she had lost that chance. The day her little bookstore closed and bankruptcy took away everything she had worked so hard to build. At 31. She thought failure had become the final chapter of her story. Instead, it was only the page that led her to the beginning. The forgotten reading hall she inherited wasn't valuable because of the old stone walls, the stained glass windows, or the thousands of carefully preserved genealogy records hidden beneath its floors. Its true value came from something far greater. It reminded every person who walked through its doors that no family is ever built only from names on a chart. Families are built through quiet sacrifices, ordinary kindness, difficult choices, shared meals, handwritten letters, bedtime stories, forgiving hearts, and generations of people who loved one another enough to leave behind pieces of themselves for those who would come after. Margaret Ellis understood that long before anyone else did. She knew that preserving genealogy was never about proving who deserved recognition. It was about making sure no child would grow up believing their family story was too ordinary to matter. No grandparents' memories would disappear simply because no one wrote them down. And no generation would lose the chance to understand the people whose courage made their own lives possible. Hannah arrived believing she had inherited an abandoned building. In reality, she inherited a promise that had begun more than a century earlier, when her own ancestors opened the reading hall with a simple belief: every family deserves to be remembered with dignity by choosing compassion over profit, patience over convenience, and people over possessions. Hannah didn't just restore an old building. She continued a legacy that would keep connecting strangers, neighbors, parents, children, and future generations long after she was gone. Maybe that's the most beautiful reminder hidden inside this story. We often think our greatest inheritance will be money, property, or success. But the richest inheritance any of us can leave behind is a story that helps the people we love understand where they came from and reminds them they have always belonged somewhere, even during the moments when life makes them feel completely alone. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below, because reading your messages and seeing this community gather from all over the world is one of my favorite parts of sharing these stories. If you're listening this morning, I hope today brings you peace, hope, and a reason to smile. If you're listening tonight, I hope you rest knowing that your own family's story matters more than you may ever realize. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, hidden legacies, family history, and ordinary people whose quiet kindness changes generations, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next unforgettable journey. Until then, take care of yourself. Ask your parents or grandparents about the stories only they can tell. Write down the memories you never want your family to lose. And always remember, every family has a story worth preserving, and every story deserves to be remembered.